T'as étudié beaucoup d'universités.
Pas beaucoup.
Il y a trop. Hein.
Ah oui, il y a beaucoup à apprendre, mais j'ai travaillé ça hier. Et puis je vais faire ça un peu cet après-midi. Et j'ai pas vraiment eu le temps. On va voir. Et toi? T'as bien travaillé?
Pas trop. Si vous n'avez pas de temps, moi, d'avoir du temps. Je sais pas comment je dois répondre.
Ouais.
Aujourd'hui, on a 3 heures de cours.
Moi, je vais pas la première. Je vais pas le truc à 4. Je viens à 14h. Je peux pas être là avant 14h.
Encore, j'ai oublié ma trousse.
Encore?
Tu penses que je me suis réveillée à 7h40. J'ai compris en voyant.
Cette semaine, tu as un examen. Parce que ça rajoute du travail en plus supplémentaire.
Combien d'heures? J'ai étudié les c'est pour ça que j'ai dormi juste avant.
Ouais, jusqu'à 7h. La dernière
Je me suis... J'ai endormi.
Continuing our work on Judith Wright. This is actually our last week on Judith Wright's poetry. So that's it. So yes, by next week we'll be starting Remembering Babylon. So make sure that you've read the novel by next week because we'll be talking about the plot and who does and who doesn't. Before we talk about Wright's poetry, I told you that I would be giving a practice exam. I forgot to upload it yesterday, I don't know why, so I'll upload it during the break. But this is the topic that you have, so you can see devoir d'entraînement. Your instructions are this. I'm giving you 2 weeks to complete it. So you need to hand it in by Wednesday, 28th of November. Pendant le cours, d'accord, je ne peux pas corriger votre devoir parce que le planning est très serré, donc si vous me le rendez après, je ne peux pas vous rendre avant la fin du semestre. D'accord, c'est pour ça que je vous mets une date limite. Ce que je vous demande de faire pour le devoir d'entraînement, c'est de rédiger à la main. L'idée, c'est de vous entraîner à ce que vous allez faire. Donc, si vous tapez, c'est pas tout à fait pareil en termes de gestion de temps. C'est pas tout à fait pareil en termes de logique non plus. à l'ordinateur, on peut déplacer des paragraphes entiers, on peut structurer un petit peu différemment. C'est beaucoup plus simple en fait de formuler une pensée avec un ordinateur que d'écrire de manière un petit peu linéaire. Je vous demande aussi, si vous pouvez le faire dans la mesure du possible dans les conditions d'examen, le but c'est de vous entraîner, c'est de voir en 4 heures ce que vous pouvez faire. Donc essayez dans la mesure du possible de faire ça. Et puis ensuite, je vous ai dit, donc vous avez 4 heures d'épreuve, il n'y a pas de document autorisé. Vous verrez, je vais vous le montrer après, le sujet que je vous propose c'est de travailler sur un sujet de dissertation. Et donc, pour une dissertation, vous vous rappelez, pour un commentaire, vous n'aurez pas droit à des documents. Par contre, si vous tombez sur une dissertation, vous aurez droit aux documents qui sont concernés. Donc, si vous tombez sur Malouf et Granville, vous avez droit à ces 2 ouvrages. Assurez-vous bien qu'il n'y a pas de notes dans ce que vous avez. C'est-à-dire qu'il peut y avoir des soulignements, mais pas de l'écriture. Donc, notamment, je vous avais dit ça, mais on en reparlera plus tard, les poèmes de Wright. Si vous les avez annotés dans tous les sens, vous les réimprimez. Il y a quelques pages pour être sûr que le jour de l'examen, vous puissiez y avoir accès. On peut vous les enlever, c'est un petit peu dommage si vous avez ça. Et puis pour le devoir d'entraînement, donc vous pouvez bien entendu, si vous voulez, consulter des documents, mais précisez-le, d'accord? Comme ça, moi, quand je corrige, je sais comment vous avez travaillé. Un étudiant qui a tous les documents et qui a accès à plein de choses, forcément, il ne génère pas la même chose que quelqu'un qui l'a pas. Donc ça, c'est le sujet sur lequel je vous propose de travailler. Donc vous pouvez voir, donc in her article on Judith Wright's poetry, dont on va parler aujourd'hui, Sue King-Smith has argued that Wright's use of spectres and spectral presence in her poems means that her readers can no longer idealize the pastoral or the pioneering history of Australia. Discuss the statement in relation to Judith Wright's poems and Kate Grenville's The Secret River. Et ensuite, ça c'est ce que vous aurez cette phrase si vous avez une dissertation dans vos instructions. Et aussi en commentaire d'ailleurs. Your analysis should draw from the theoretical and literary concepts discussed in the course and may refer to other works studied in class. Donc bien sûr là, j'ai pas le choix pour un devoir d'entraînement, on n'a pas travaillé sur Remembering Babylon, donc j'ai pas le choix que de vous donner Grenville et puis Judith Wright, d'accord? Donc c'est pour ça que ça porte là-dessus. L'idée du devoir d'entraînement, donc bien entendu, dans l'idéal, vous prenez 4 heures chez vous, sans document, et vous travaillez, vous le faites correctement. Ça, c'est le truc le plus intéressant, on va dire, pour le devoir d'entraînement. Si vous n'avez pas le temps, moi, je veux bien accepter de corriger, par exemple, un plan, ou alors de corriger, on va dire, un plan avec une partie rédigée, ou plusieurs, si vous n'avez pas le temps de rédiger tout ça. En revanche, quand même, je me permets de vous dire qu'à partir d'un plan, c'est extrêmement difficile de juger. C'est-à-dire qu'un plan peut avoir l'air nul ici, mais quand il est rédigé, il est génial. Inversement, un plan peut avoir l'air très très bien, et une fois rédigé, il peut avoir des problèmes. C'est-à-dire plus vous allez faire l'exercice que je vous demande de faire à l'examen, plus vous allez avoir un retour qui est correct, enfin qui est, on va dire, le plus précis sur votre travail. C'est vrai que souvent, les plans ont l'air bien parce qu'on met des titres, mais après, la démonstration, c'est ce qui fait défaut. D'accord? Donc après, c'est optionnel, d'accord? Il n'y a pas d'obligation de faire ça, on en parlera en cours la dernière semaine quand je vous rendrai vos copies, enfin de ceux qui les auront rendues, mais bien entendu c'est tout à votre... c'est intéressant pour vous de le faire. Après, voilà, vous choisissez si vous voulez le faire ou pas, en tout cas on en parlera un petit peu plus dans la dernière semaine. Voilà, donc je mettrai ça en ligne à la pause, je ne sais pas pourquoi hier, j'ai fait le sujet puis je l'ai jamais mis en ligne. Il y a eu un coup spatio-temporel, voilà. Ok, pas de questions là-dessus? Ça va? Alright, et bien on va s'intéresser à Judith Wright. Je vous avais dit la semaine dernière qu'on avait parlé assez rapidement de Nigger's Leap. Donc juste qu'on va en reparler un petit peu là en début de ce cours et puis ensuite on s'intéressera à d'autres poèmes. As you can see, for Judith Wright, we have analyzed 2 poems in a lot of details. If you get a commentary, you will not get Borrowing and you will not get Nigger's Leap. Okay, obviously I'm not asking you to repeat. So make sure, this is what we'll be doing this week and next week, make sure that you understand the other poems. Okay, all of these poems that we haven't studied together, At Kalula, Old House, At Kalula, etc. You should feel that you can analyze by yourself. So don't hesitate if you have any questions. If you get a commentary on Wright and something else, you will get those poems that we haven't studied together. What we're doing with Borrowing and Nigger's Leap is really to try to establish some major logics in Wright's work, and also to try to get you to understand what I mean when I mean a commentary. That is something really detailed. So for Nigger's Leap, You remember this is the poem about Aborigines falling off the cliff. Last week we talked a lot about this. C'est pas ça? Sorry. We talked a lot about the night and the tide. Okay, so we spoke in particular about the fact that there's a whole range of meanings that are associated with the night in the poem. You remember the night hides the bodies, it also protects them, but it also asks questions. You remember this section here, night is a time for synthesis, so night is a time for reflection. And you remember as well that we talked about the fact that night is that moment when it's more dangerous to navigate the seas. Okay, so night is also being portrayed as something where you've got a danger. So you can see that there are a multitude of meanings associated with the night, and that's what makes the poem a bit difficult to grasp, among other things. But you can see that she's also trying to say that obscurity obscures lots of things, but that it also reveals a lot of hidden anxieties, a lot of hidden dangers. Okay, so you can see that there's a whole image for this, and we also insisted last week on the fact that night and the tide are natural phenomena. They're cyclical, they're something that you cannot stop. Okay, so she's basically arguing through this image that you've got an inevitable return of anxiety, return of danger, return of all of this through this image of the night. Now, some of the things we haven't talked about is the fact, I think this is quite obvious, but the fact that basically you've got a personification of a lot of natural elements. This is something that we had in Bora Ring as well, except that the personification was directly connected to Aborigines. Okay, you had nature that was personified as pretty much Aboriginal characters. Here you can see that the air is being addressed, so oh lonely air, and you can also see that the night, yes, you can see as well that you've got that you've got this idea of protection, that the night and the dark air are going to basically create a quilt, that they are being addressed. Okay, so do take this into account and think about the differences that exist between Bora Ring and this. Now, one point that has been made about Judith Wright's poetry is that she often considers, speaks about Aborigines obviously as victims of history and as victims of settlers. What she also does, and this is something that we talked about in connection to the Secret River, is to speak about settlers as victims of their own actions. So in particular, in this poem, you can see that, of course, Aborigines are victims. They're the ones that fall off the cliff. They're the bodies that are protected, hidden, etc. by the night. But you can also see that you've got an idea that whites are going to pay for this, that they are going to be, that their guilt is going to be forever present. So you can see in particular this, in those images, the idea that their blood channeled the rivers, that is, the murders are present in the very elements, in the very natural elements. The fact that the black dust, so obviously referring to their bodies, is actually being ingested by the crops. Okay, so this idea that you can't really erase the murders. Now, one point that has been made by a number of critics, if you have a look at those last two lines, in those last two lines you've got the narrator saying, night floods us suddenly as history that has sunk many islands in its good time. So you've got an idea that because of the guilt, because of the actions made by white settlers, they are going to be threatened. Okay, maybe their civilization history will necessarily bring destruction to them. Okay, whatever negative action you've done comes back to you. So you can see that what she's saying is that there's basically a common fate for Aborigines and for whites. And what a lot of people have said is that this basically reduces the distance between the true victim, that is Aborigines, and the aggressor. I'm not sure if you see what I mean. Basically, this idea that you've got a conflation, a correspondence that is established between the suffering and the fate of Aborigines and the suffering and the fate of the settlers. Okay, a little bit of what takes place in the Secret River, pretty much. That at the same time as you're considering Aboriginal suffering, you're considering settler suffering, establishing links between them and therefore reducing, in a way, the true suffering of Aboriginal people. Now, just a couple of really small details about the poem. I'm not sure if you picked up, there's a reference to a very well-known poem through the term mariners and through that idea of mariners being basically a threat. No particular idea. This is actually a reference. You've got, there are a number of images, obviously in English, British, English language literature that can be taken up. This can be considered as a reference to Coleridge, the rhyme of the ancient mariner. On est d'accord, c'est du détail, hein, je ne vous demande pas de reconnaître ça à un examen pour votre culture. But basically, have any of you guys read this poem? This is a poem, it's very long, it's about 50 pages. It's a bit strange to read, but it's a very well-known story of a crew that is on a ship, and the crew basically kills an albatross. And as the albatross sinks into the ocean, they get cursed for having killed the albatross. Okay, so you have this idea here of that term mariner basically evokes this whole universe, this whole idea of the curse with the albatross. So you don't have any bird images in this, but you do have this evocation of this poem where you do have a similar idea of a curse for an original murder. So here the murder is the albatross that represents, ideals, etc., and it's a needless murder. But you do have an evocation of this. Okay, as you know, references to other works. Are called intertextuality. Okay, so obviously here this is quite veiled. Okay, but it's an interesting poem to read if you have the time. It's the language is a bit painful to read, but it's an interesting one, and it's a poem that's evoked, that's been referenced in lots of other works. It's very influential. All right. Any questions or maybe lines that you didn't understand that you would like us to look at together? Happy? All right, perfect. Well then, yes. Let's speak about the article that I asked you to read at home. But they're really here to get you to think about some of the various points that you can think about, some of the problems that can be addressed in connection to the works that we're studying. So obviously they're here to help you analyze them in more detail, pretty much. So what are some of the elements, some of the arguments that you find useful or problematic, or some of the things that you underlined that you felt is useful in connection to Wright's poetry?
Comfortable with this, with the fact that there is a conflict between this Wright's attachment to the land and the sense of guilt because of colonialist imposition of the land. As a child, she was really in love with her place, and when she studied the history of Australia, she realized that her ancestors were not that great, and that her presence on the land is because of a lot of killings and
Okay, yes, so definitely you've got, as you said, she talks about this tension in Wright's own life between her attachment for the land and her understanding that her presence to the land is only enabled by previous violence on Indigenous peoples. So she's very much aware and very uncomfortable towards this, as you can imagine. Alright, so this very ambiguous position, her own problem, I guess you can see how she's trying to resolve this in a lot of her poems. You know, I told you about the fact that some of her poems are really mourning poems. This is the case for Bora Ring, it's the case for Niggers Leap. You'll see that some of the poems we'll deal with today are less centered on this, settlers, Aborigines, just like one of the poems that, yeah, so basically you have this, and you can see that in the mourning poems, she's really trying to come to terms with this in a way. She's really trying to, I don't know, find a way to live with that, find a way to formulate that as well. Alright, what are some of the other elements that you underlined in this?
she became aware of common amnesia in Australia, and she felt somehow alienated from her home country because she was delusional about it. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's also, you know, in the poems, I guess there's a personal step, as we said, of her coming to terms with her own connection to the land. As you said, if we connect this to the idea of amnesia, I think there's also a dimension of bringing this history to the attention of people. There's definitely something about witnessing or telling the story of Aborigines and trying to intensify people's awareness of this. That these are definitely two dimensions of the mourning poems, at least. What else did you find?
So she's one of the first actually to raise this awareness, or people awareness about Aborigines people and the other side of history that hasn't been told. And there is something else. There is another side of her career or its centers of interest, which is the environment, which is very, very important. Not all the stanzas and poems are about Aborigines, but some of them are about environment and how settlers not only destroy Aborigines but destroy the environment. And this is a very contemporary issue, I'd say. And yeah, it's very important for her. I read that she was in the 60s. She created a wildlife movement. She was a president of it. So yeah, that's very important to underline, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, but I mentioned that sometimes conservation movements can be opposed to Aborigines' presence in national parks. And if you read the section where they speak about Wright's commitment to wilderness, she was trying to fight for an understanding of national parks and wild areas that would make room for Aboriginal people. Unlike some people, you know, that want national parks to be 100% nature and not to actually consider Aboriginal presence in this. If you remember, when we read this document, this one, je sais plus où est la citation,
je sais plus où c'est. Ah si, c'est là. Non, je sais plus où c'est. Ouais, c'est ça. Pardon. Ça fait des allers-retours. But basically, she tried to really insist on this. This is something that has become quite accepted in Australia today, but that wasn't at the time. The idea that basically the land is not something that is untouched. Okay, if today everyone that lives in the Vosges believes is going to be a pretty dense area in the next 10 to 20 years, the work of man on the environment is tremendous, and the work of Aborigines on the Australian environment was also essential. So you can see that she talked about it as a managed estate, and to her it was important to give Aborigines the opportunity to co-manage at least the land that they're on, as opposed to some people that just want national parks to be free from any sort of human interaction, which is in itself, you know, depending on your point of view, that can be, of course, a problem. All right. What are some of the other elements that you wrote down, maybe some of the ones that you found problematic? We can also speak about this.
There is the idea of possession as well. At some point she said that, I think she's quoted somewhere, she said that she loved her land and suddenly she realized it wasn't hers. So she sort of questioned whose land is it? Is it Aboriginal land, or if you're born there, is it yours as well? I think that was very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
There is a notion of spectral absence of Aboriginal people. I saw that it talks about the fact that even if Aborigines have been moved away, they are still present in nature. They are a part of the land. So Wright talks a lot about the fact that she personified nature with Aboriginal.
Yeah, okay, all right. I guess, you know, we've been talking about this without using the word spectre in Bora Ring. We talked about the personification of the land, the presence of Aborigines through nature. You can see that this critic chooses to refer to this through the idea of a spectre. So considering that Aborigines are present as spectres basically in the Australian land, and this is how Judith Wright represents them, to try to give a sense of basically their legitimacy, their earlier presence, to try to really do this. So you can formulate it in those terms if you want. This is not something that we've done so far, but you can see that this is quite a useful way to think about it, this spectral presence of the past. What else did you find? That's pretty good already. Any other points or... If we speak about spectres, you can see that the author actually argues that there are three different spectres in Wright's writing. This is what you have right at the beginning. You can see that she's considering that there's a first ghostly presence that exists in Wright's writing. You can see this at the bottom of the first page. Her exploration of her ancestral history and her familial complexity in the process of dispossession and environmental degradation. So you can see that she identifies this as a ghostly thread. Again, not something that is present explicitly in contemporary Australia, but something that she chooses to intertwine in her poems, that she chooses to remind readers constantly of that history. This is a choice that she makes. And you can see that this first spectre is related to the other two spectres You can see the first one here on page 118, the traces of Aboriginal massacres and dispossessions, and then finally the spectre of the indigenous landscape that existed prior to British occupation. So you can see that we can already identify these, not so much the familial history, because she doesn't speak about her own family, she speaks about settlers in very generic terms, in fact, in the two poems that we've looked at. But you can see that Bora Ring is more about the spectre of indigenous landscape. This is mentioned, and you've got the idea of massacres and dispossessions that have resulted in it. But you can see that in Bora Ring, you've got a refusal to describe the massacres. You've got before and after, and you've got this hole in the middle, bless you, as opposed to Niggers Leap, where in this Niggers Leap, you've got a description of that moment, and you don't really have any description of the landscape that existed before. Okay, so you can see that you've got, if you want, different spectres in the two poems. Bon, on va faire dans l'ordre des choses. This is a very important point, the romantic dimension of Wright's writing. I'm guessing maybe you did not formulate it explicitly, but I'm sure you can all see that it's a very romantic way of writing. What are some of the characteristics of romantic writing, generally speaking?
It always happens in the natural environment.
Yeah, okay, so connection, presence, or location in nature. What else?
Nature is a means to enter into a meditation state of meditation.
Yeah, okay, so, yep, I'm not going to reformulate that works well. Yeah, so entering a state of meditation, accessing, philosophical thoughts by observing or being present in nature, experiencing it. Donc, bien sûr, dans Bora Ring, théoriquement, le narrateur, d'accord, c'est pas Wright elle-même, mais le narrateur, il est assis, il voit des anciennes traces de Bora Ring et il a toutes ces réflexions philosophiques sur l'histoire et le temps et le crime et tout ça, etc. What else about romantic writing? Yeah, yeah, definitely. You know that originally Romanticism is a reaction to the Enlightenment and rationalism. Je me dis, ça met une plombe à écrire, à taper, ça doit mettre 4 secondes, mais avec ma vieille crèche, Sorry. It's a reaction to the Enlightenment and rationalism, so it's an emphasis on emotions, and in particular on subjectivity. Okay? Of course, rational thought, the Enlightenment was trying to favor really structured thinking, was trying to favor objectivity, empiricism in science, etc. As opposed to Romanticism, as a reaction to this, that emphasizes emotion, that emphasizes a psychological dimension, and that emphasizes the self. Okay, so a focus on your own emotion, on your own feelings. On est d'accord que c'est quand même présent dans l'écriture de Wright. Cette dimension-là. What else about Romanticism? I guess we've mentioned some of the major aspects. I'm looking for one word. I'm looking for this. The sublime. What does that refer to in connection to Romanticism? You've probably come across this. Or not. What's the sublime?
A feeling of awe when man is confronted to nature, and the fact that he's aware of the power of nature.
Yeah, pretty much. The sublime is a feeling you're supposed to get from observing nature only. And the sublime is supposed to combine two different feelings. The first one is admiration, and the second one is close to fear or terror. Okay, for instance, if you witness a major storm, if you witness, I don't know, a tsunami or something really powerful from nature, there's a beauty in what nature is able to generate. There's also a horror in the fact that we're very small compared to those events. Okay, so this is the sublime, this combination of basically admiration and fear, which you can summarize as awe, standing in awe of nature, that is both admiring what nature is doing and finding it beautiful, but at the same time knowing that as a human being, we're very, very small compared to these events. Okay, so the terror and the power, the force, basically, of nature in all its beauty and all its horror. So, you need to think about this as well in connection to right. I guess we can connect this to the night and the role of the tide in Judith Wright's writing. Okay, you've got moments when nature is extremely powerful, but also, you know, here of the night, the tide basically protects the body, but at the same time threatens the settlers. So you can feel some of this power of nature that is overwhelming, that is dominating as well the history of men. Okay, so think about it. Of course, in Wright, in the poems that we've had a look at, the sublime is not so much about beautiful nature. It's much more about the power of nature and how much nature encompasses a lot more than our human history. Je pense que quand on lit Ring, on a vraiment cette idée-là qu'en fait, ce qu'elle dit, ce qu'on ne formule pas forcément explicitement, c'est que pour elle, la nature, c'est une base, et puis vous avez la présence d'hommes à un certain moment, mais la nature, c'est vraiment ce qui va rester. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a une idée que c'est ça qui constitue la continuité. On peut voir sur la nature l'impact des hommes des différents groupes, donc les aborigènes qui ont eu un impact différent des colonisateurs, mais l'idée, c'est quand même que la nature, elle est là sur le beaucoup plus long terme que les humains. Vous avez quand même cette idée-là dans le livre. So make sure that you consider this romantic heritage. Je cherche l'argument qui m'intéresse. There we go. So if you take page 125, on est up là. You can see that there's an argument made by Andrew McCann, who, in connection to this romantic aesthetic, so if we read this together, you can see Andrew McCann has suggested that even the more progressive Australian poets, including Wright, undermine their political stance when they adopt romantic understandings of the land. Qu'est-ce qu'il dit? So you can see that she rephrases this here, saying that a romantic aesthetic is aberrant and it has the potential to anesthetize the reader to the violence of the colonization process. So you can see that the argument here is that by taking a romantic aesthetic, by focusing on emotions, focusing on the sublime, focusing on the role of nature, in a way your focus is very much on that, on the sublime, on nature, and not so much on the actual violence that took place. On est d'accord que quand on lit Niggas Sleep, bon, il y a 2-3 images qui sont pas sympathiques, mais vous n'êtes pas en train de voir, vous n'êtes pas en train de lire quelque chose qui est horrifiant, d'accord? Vous avez plutôt une espèce de nostalgie, de mélancolie, vous avez une description un peu lyrique, tout ça, de ce qui se passe, la marée, tout ça, etc. C'est pas la même chose que d'avoir une description très réaliste de l'horreur de meurtre, de l'horreur des corps en décomposition, etc. D'accord? Donc c'est toute l'idée que cette esthétique, quelque part la façon dont Wright elle va décrire ça, cette esthétique très romantique, elle limite en fait l'horreur de la chose. Et du coup, elle limite un petit peu l'impact de ces poèmes, l'impact politique de ces poèmes. Do you guys see what I mean? You'll see that this is very much something that we have in Remembering Babylon. Okay, this idea of a romantic aesthetic, basically limiting the political dimension of the work. Okay, so keep this in mind, this idea that basically the more romantically you write, in a way, the more you anesthetize the reader, the more you limit the horror of the description by making it beautiful. D'accord? C'est beau l'écriture lyrique, c'est beaucoup plus c'est beaucoup plus fluide, on va dire, que d'autres écritures qui peuvent être beaucoup plus sur le mode de la confrontation, sur le mode de l'horreur. D'accord? Donc bien prendre ça en compte, that this tone actually has an impact on the way that we read Wright. All right. And then you can see this is just a minor point. On est où? Notes. Ah, pardon. J'arrive plus. 127. There we go. You can see here, this is where I got you the quote devoir d'entraînement. Okay, the idea that she argues that because you've got spectres in rights writing, you're forcing readers to rethink the landscape, and therefore she considers that the audience can no longer idealize the pastoral or the pioneering history of Australia. It's no longer possible to think about it in only positive terms. If at the exam you do get a quote, you need to locate that quote in the article where it comes from. Okay, so for instance, here you've got an argument about, in the devoir d'entraînement, you've got an argument about the presence of spectres and the impact that this has on the audience. You need to show that you understand where this comes from and what the general argument of this person is. Okay, so make sure when you revise that you actually keep the articles in mind. Okay, they're here as well to help you think about the novels and the works, and they're also here to, you should be aware of who's basically maintained what argument. Ça va? Any questions about this article? No particular sections that you hate? Misunderstand? Perfect. So we are going to work on a very different type of poem. Okay, we've done all the warning, blah blah blah. This is such a sad history. We'll be looking at another dimension of rights writing. So if you can get at Cedar Creek. So this is a 2-page poem. What I'd like you to do is to read it, try to figure out the structure of the poem. In particular, when you've got shifts in voice or in point of view. Okay, so try to identify when this takes place, and then of course try to identify the message of the poem. What is the poem about? What's the moral, the lesson or the message of the poem that right constitutes? Okay? Je vous laisse, je ne sais pas combien de temps vous avez besoin, 10-15 minutes pour lire tranquillement et puis essayer d'identifier tout ça.
that maybe we take the break now, because otherwise I think it will get us to quite late. So 5-minute break, and then we'll talk about the tomorrow.
It's a nice one. This one is very nice. I like this one. I lost it. I like this one. I started to work on it.
Quelles sont les différences entre objectif et séance peut-être par exemple tâches intermédiaires ou par exemple micro-tâches? Quelles sont
Oui.
les différences?
Alors en fait, ça se passe comme ça.
Oui,
Oui, voilà, c'est ça. Donc ça, c'est une séquence. Ça, c'est une séquence. Dans différentes séquences, tu as plusieurs séances. You know, on the English book you have always lesson 1, lesson 2. So you have one unit, you have many units. And basically one, for example, let's say this is, I like the example that you took. I mean, this sequence is, for example, about shopping. You will do 3 weeks, 4 weeks of shopping. So first week is going to be séance 1. You will do markets. So you will have a lesson on markets, the vocabulary, the grammar about markets. Séance 2, the week after, you will do online shopping. Okay, so in one sequence unit, you have many lessons, but it's always the same theme.
Theme.
Yeah.
Par
Okay.
exemple, oui, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de séances, et donc ces séances, on parle à propos d'une unité, par exemple, shopping.
Oui,
Shopping
voilà.
online.
Ou alors, par exemple, ça peut être war.
Ouais.
Et donc, chaque leçon va aborder le sujet d'un angle différent. Donc ça permet d'apprendre un vocabulaire différent. Alors, l'objectif, c'est de tu as un objectif de toute la séquence. Par exemple,
Augmenter le vocabulaire à propos de
la politique de shopping. Politique, c'est mieux que shopping, tu ne fais pas une séquence de
encore,
shopping.
par exemple, à propos de grammaire.
C'est plutôt des thèmes. Par exemple, la culture britannique. Et par exemple, une séquence, ça peut être de la rentrée en septembre jusque les vacances de la Toussaint en novembre. Ça, c'est une séquence. Et pendant cette séquence, on va faire de la civilisation britannique. Et tu vas aborder le thème du
séquence.
Et ensuite, chaque séance va aborder un point différent.
Ouais. Mais du coup, par exemple, civilisation britannique, c'est...
Par exemple, séance 1, la monarchie. Séance 2, les Spice Girls. Séance 3, et donc tu peux faire le vocabulaire de la monarchie. Séance 2, tu feras tout le vocabulaire musique, culture, mode, voilà. Et en fait, voilà, chaque séance a un thème, un sous-thème en fait, un sous-thème. Parce que après, dans une séance, oui, ça c'est une séance. Ça c'est donc dans une séance, tu as un objectif principal. C'est pas une tâche. C'est un objectif.
Ça dépend de tâches. Ça dépend de
Parce que par exemple, un objectif, ça serait l'objectif de ta séance, c'est aujourd'hui, je veux que mes élèves soient capables d'apprendre ce vocabulaire de la monarchie. Donc, tu vas apprendre quoi? Et la tâche?
Pendant le micro-tâche, pendant le intermédiaire, ça pendant les séances. proche, pendant les séances, pendant les cours, pendant les cours.
Voilà, ça c'était.
Là, prof utilise les compétences des élèves pour les amener les finalités au final tâche. Mais ici, que la prof utilise nos compétences pour les amener aux tâches finales, il y a les objectifs ici, par exemple, tu vois, objectif ici, linguistique, lexical, tu vois, linguistique,
Oui, par
lexical,
exemple,
dramatique.
on va prendre l'exemple de la monarchie anglaise, la reine. Donc la séance, c'est le thème de la séance, c'est la monarchie. Le thème de la séquence, c'est la civilisation britannique.
Culture.
Culture britannique. Une séance sur la monarchie. Donc l'objectif, la tâche finale, ça serait écrire un discours. You are the queen, you write a speech. Okay. So ça c'est la tâche finale. La sous-tâche, ça va être écouter un discours, par exemple, en classe, et noter les mots de vocabulaire, noter les
Ici, c'est objectif, c'est quoi? C'est
comprendre, là c'est de la compréhension
orale et aussi écrit, c'est production orale.
Oui, mais ça c'est à la fin, parce que tu fais le discours.
Ouais, c'est un peu...
Par exemple, en fait, le but de la séance à la fin, c'est de dire un discours. C'est d'écrire un discours.
Oui.
Ça c'est l'objectif, la tâche de la séance, la tâche finale. Mais pour arriver à ça, tu vas avoir différentes petites tâches, comme écouter un discours, étudier le vocabulaire du discours, tout ça. Pour pouvoir à la fin, tu vas utiliser toutes tes petites compétences-là pour faire un vrai discours. Donc c'est les sous-tâches qui amènent à la tâche finale.
Ouais. Je voulais... Oui.
C'est juste, en fait, moi j'ai pas j'ai vraiment pas du tout.
Mais par exemple, si par exemple, comment tu veux dire que ici, les étudiants sont dans quel référence
Ça dépend de la compétence. Par exemple, le cycle 4, tu sais que le cycle 4...
Cycle 4, oui. On doit mémoriser les cycles. Cycle 4, cycle 4, c'est pour collège? Non,
oui,
c'est pour lycée.
C'est la fin du collège, 5e, 4e, 3e.
Ouais.
Et ces gens-là, à la fin du cycle, doivent arriver au niveau B1. C'est niveau A2, B1. Collège.
Mais du coup, c'est quoi programme ici? Programme.
So let's have a look at what your thoughts are on Etsy and Creek. So maybe illogically we'll start with the last point. This way we can clarify basically what the poem's about, and then we can have a look at the shifts and voices. You can see, of course, course, I don't need to tell you this, that this is quite a different type of poem. Okay, you've got very different writing. You don't have as much of a romantic, lyrical dimension. It's quite different. So, what's this poem about for you guys?
Well, for me, it was about the relationship between the nature and human, the impact that human has on the nature. That was the whole message about it, and the belief that human has toward religious things, not toward nature. I will define that later. And then for this, the structure is just like the question response. You know, like she asked a rhetoric question. We exactly know what is the answer of that question. She asked the questions of herself. I don't know if it's asking a question of herself or the readers or somebody else. And the shifts in her voice happens between her poems and the religious person. I'm not sure for that. But what I'm trying to say is that when a human believes in religious stuff, they believe it like they don't think about it rationally. I mean, when we look at nature, nature gives us everything. I mean, what we have, everything that we have is because of the nature. Nature gives us, but what we give to nature is nothing. We destroy nature. We throw plastic into everywhere. But for religious part, we don't get anything from religious, but we still respect it. For example, like in a part when she says monk are singing in mountain, when they try to pray, when they try to go to the place of temple of praying, they go to that temple with slippers because they don't want that temple to be dirty. They respect the religious, but do they respect the nature? No. It's just like
Okay. All right. I agree with you. I wouldn't see religion as being the central to the poem.
I didn't say it's central. I'm just saying that people care much more about the things that are not rational rather than the things that are really, real. I mean, nature is real, gives you everything. What you have is because of the nature. But what you give to nature is nothing. You throw bags, plastic to the nature. You destroy nature.
Okay.
But in the other part, you really respect that part. You don't get anything from it, but you still care about that part rather than caring about the other.
Okay. All right. I see what you mean. I agree. That we do have a very central theme of the environment and human destruction of the environment, the connection between mankind and nature. There are, as you said, some religious references. Some of them are a bit difficult to, how can I say, analyze. This section here, I'm not sure if you were happy with it. It's pretty packed and difficult to analyze, but it's true what you said. When she speaks about Japan, you can see some form of respect for religious institutions, which is not the respect that you find for the river. Kamo is a local river in Kyoto. So this is something that we can talk about. Okay. All right. What is the question that she's asking in the poem? You said there's a clear question she's asking. What is she looking for in this poem?
The inspiration for poetry.
Yep.
She's losing, her inspiration because usually she gets inspiration in the nature, and as far as nature is destroyed by human beings, she can't get anything from nature now.
Yeah, pretty much. Very well summarized. This is the question that you have at the beginning that she keeps asking and that she concludes on at the end. As you said, when she's talking about the formula for poetry, she's thinking about where to find inspiration, how to write poetry. How can you write poetry when what is beautiful, what is inspiring, is being destroyed as you experience life? Okay, so this is very much her thought here. How can she write poetry? Where can she find inspiration? And then she's trying to show all of the things that constitute obstacles to this in the contemporary world. Okay, what's her reply to this? Like, can she find inspiration? What's the sort of conclusion? What does she conclude on in regards to her own inspiration for poetry?
The last stanza talks about, well, it doesn't talk about it, but she talks about Cedar Creek, so it's where she lives actually. It's in Tambourine Mountain, I think. I looked up for this. And maybe she went there, it was in nature, and she was seeking inspiration there in the 50s when she moved there. But now everything, I don't have the date of the text actually, but I think
it's the 70s.
Yes, probably, because it became a very touristy attraction. And she said that now nothing...
76.
Yeah. So it was probably already a touristy attraction in the 70s. So she said that where she used to find inspiration by waterfalls of Cedar Creek, she can't find it anymore because now it's just tourist rubbish everywhere, basically. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is necessarily connected 100% to tourism. I think it's more about daily life because you've got the pig farm, the beer bottles that would, as you said, this can be about presence on the land, but I think it's more about the usual inhabitants there. I think, at the end, she does mention the fact that there are no cedars in a place that's called Cedar Creek. Okay, so she's taking this to be a very symbolic dimension that what the name that this place has is basically no longer present.
Well, usual nature was the inspiration for romantic poetry, but now the inspiration is, I don't know if I should say that, but she gets her inspiration from being all the rubbish. So it's, it's a kind of nihilist poetry now.
Yeah. Okay. I see. I see what you mean. I guess there's a dimension of nostalgia for the type of inspiration that she could have at the time. And as you said, the end here, you've got the idea that from the plastic bags, the beer bottles, the pig farm, you've got an old radiance, so you've got an old light, if you want, an old presence that she can almost perceive and that she can try to use. But you can see that this is very much, again, she likes to complain, doesn't she? This is very much a lament for the loss of nature, for the loss of inspiration. And what she's arguing is that the loss of nature is not just the loss of trees and things like that. To her, it's the loss of a way of living, it's also a loss for inspiration, etc. So she's, we tend to separate nature from culture, from cities, etc. Here you can see a much more inclusive understanding of nature, a much more total, if you want, understanding of nature, of the impact of the loss of nature on her life. If you have a look at this, there's a very symbolic dimension to the idea of the garden, because this is where she starts and where she ends. You can see that she says she's abandoned the garden is overgrown, and it's got weeds that are not native to this country. So the garden as a small area also represents a lot of the changes that have taken place. You can see that they no longer go there. You know that in Australian environmentalism, non-native trees, non-native plants are extremely problematic. En ce moment, il y a des campagnes dans toutes les villes. En fait, il faut voir que si vous allez à Melbourne, vous allez à Sydney, vous pouvez reconnaître les zones riches aux arbres. C'est-à-dire que les zones riches à Melbourne, vous allez à Toorak, vous avez que des platanes. D'accord? Ça, c'était parce qu'à l'époque, les riches, qu'est-ce qu'ils voulaient? Ils voulaient voir des platanes, ils voulaient voir des peupliers, des choses comme ça, des arbres européens, ça coûtait extrêmement cher de les faire venir. D'accord? Donc les zones, même aujourd'hui, en fait, les 3/4 des zones très très riches, ils ont des arbres qui ne sont pas australiens. Donc il y a beaucoup de campagnes en ce moment qui sont faites pour ne pas replanter, en tout cas d'arbres européens, pas forcément les détruire, parce qu'il y a des platanes qui sont beaux, etc. aujourd'hui. Mais l'idée, c'est vraiment que dès qu'on plante un nouvel arbre, ce soit un arbre local, ce soit un arbre australien. Donc ici, le fait de parler du fait que vous avez des plantes qui ne sont pas australiennes, ça montre aussi un petit peu les excès quelque part de l'action humaine sur la nature. Il y a des choses qui ne font pas du tout sens là-dessus. And you can see at the end that she says that time alters the shapes of the garden, introduces new weeds.
And you can see this idea again that this garden basically represents nature as a whole in the poem. You start with it, you end with it at a very small scale. It represents some of the large-scale changes that are taking place in nature in Australia. So that's I guess the main message of the excuse me, of the poem. What do you make of the rest of it? There's a whole chunk in the middle that's a bit more, I guess, fluid, we'll say. What would you say she addresses? What are some of the shifts that you identified maybe in points of view or in voice? What do you make of the rest of the poem in between the sections on the garden? What are some of those shifts that you identified when you were working on this before the break? No shifts.
Wasn't that I said the shift between the...
Yeah, but where exactly?
Where?
And I don't see any religious voices.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, you can't just speak about it generally. Don't you guys feel that there's a shift all the time in the type of voice that you get? What's this here? Banking and industry welcome the big sellout. Reportage's new approach, food or famine.
Headlines.
Yeah, the headlines. Okay, so you can see that here you've got the voice of the poet through the device of a narrator. D'accord, rappelez-vous? Oui, certes, c'est sûrement derrière c'est J8 qui écrit, mais c'est quand même J8 qui constitue un personnage de narrateur et qui parle à travers ça. D'accord? On est quand même dans la fiction. But you can see that here, in this whole section, there until condemned, you actually have the headlines. So she would actually have written or invented, we don't know, but morning headlines. So you've got a shift from the voice of the narrator or the voice of the poet, if you want, to the headlines. There are other shifts. You can see here my desk is silted with papers. And then you probably have the post-it notes that she has. Post-it notes, I don't know, other forms of paper that you have here. So here again, you've got a shift in the voice, okay, or in at least the format. So you can see here, right to the minister, protest, torture of political prisoners, save the forest. These are all of the aims that she has. And you can, as you can see, protest the pollution of estuaries, demand no high-rise. High-rise, those skyscrapers, that is the large buildings, the tall buildings that you can have in an area. And so you can see that this is quite a different tone as well when you've got your own list and when you've got the voice of the poet. There's a weird thing here. What do you make of this? This is a difficult section.
It looks like a manifesto.
Okay.
No?
I don't know.
I feel like it, but I don't know. Because she's addressing, or the narrator is addressing sort of generally to the, well, to the reader. I mean, it's, yeah, like a manifesto.
It's a very general section. It's very difficult to connect it. I think she's trying to evoke the different ways in which you can be inspired for poetry. She's asking that question again, where to look for the formula. So she looks at all sorts of cultural theories, if you want, and here she's sort of bringing them all together in a way that doesn't really make sense. So she talks about ritual connections between culture and nature, primitive people, gifts, religion, metaphorical apprehensions. I think here the idea is that she's trying to think about what can inspire her, and she's trying to think about cultural sophistication, cultural, quasiment des réactions primitives, des choses qu'il y a en commun dans toutes les cultures. She's trying to think about this. To me, you don't necessarily need to make sense of all of this because it's impossible
it's very cryptic. And I think that's the whole aim, like where can I find the inspiration? She starts, where can I find the inspiration? I've got all the morning headlines conflict with this need for inspiration. You've got all of these anxiety-generating headlines. You've got all of the things that she's supposed to do. And then you've got all of these complex cultural reflections that she doesn't know what to make of either. And then you can see that you've got a section here where she's, again, shifting voices. Whose or what voice is this? Dans cette section-là. Meanwhile, keep lifting production, for that is the answer to inflation. I guess we agree this is not the poet's voice, okay? This is not Wright or the narrator's voice. Whose or what voice is that? What would generate this sort of discourse?
Politicians.
Yeah, probably politicians, the government, maybe the news or something like that. But you can see that this is more of an institutional voice. This is more the consensus that exists today in our modern capitalist societies. Okay, the need to keep lifting production because this way you're going to have continuous growth. So you can see that she's basically showing her own struggle within a contemporary society to try to find some sort of quiet inspiration for poetry. So she speaks about this. You can see that here again we've got a change, maybe not of voice or point of view, but a change of tone. We're going back to a very slow rhythm. I'm not sure if you noticed, but you've got lots of different rhythms in this poem. Sometimes we're really fast, sometimes it's very slow. You keep being stopped in the way that you read. So here we're going back to a much slower rhythm, speaking, as we said, about the connection, the respect for religion, but also so respecting temples, but not respecting rivers in a way, if we simplify this section. Now, you know that our next work is Remembering Babylon, so you can see that we will be speaking a little bit about Babylon. Babylon and Zion work as mythic references. What are they references to? This will be useful when we speak about Remembering Babylon. Do you guys?
Babylon?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it refers to the ancient city of Babylon, or the ancient, how to say it, the development of our language. There was the people that tried to build a tower of Babylon, and then something happened. I don't know.
Something bad happens.
They changed their language, because before that everybody spoke one language, and then they tried to see God or something like that, and then God became angry, and then changed every language.
Yeah?
Like that.
Okay. That's pretty much it. The story of Babylon is, as you said, an ancient city, which represents a golden age, but which also represents a decaying age. Because the story of Babylon is that the people of Babylon tried to build a tower to reach the skies, the Tower of Babel, and that God became angry at this, and because of this, cursed them by giving them multiple languages, that is, by breaking down the possibility for communication within the city. So you can see that Babylon does represent this golden age, this moment when everyone spoke the same language, but also represent that moment when this form of communication stopped. D'accord? Ça dépend si vous regardez Babylone avant ou après la punition. D'accord? So Babylon can represent both of these, but it's very much a symbol of communication, a symbol as well of divine punishment. Zion, on the other hand, is more of a representation of an idealized, unified community. Okay, so if you want, yes, oh sorry. Okay, so Zion is more of a symbol, if you want, of unity and harmony in society. Okay, so the full realization of unity and harmony. So
So you can see that you've got this idea. There was a formula for the inspiration of poetry, for writing poetry, under the willows of Babylon. So here she's referring to the mythic, idealized early time of Babylon, but the children have never seen Zion. That is, that the children have never seen a fully realized, harmonious society. Okay, this is pretty much the message that you have here. And you can see here that you've got a very cryptic reference to a they, which is quite difficult to identify. Like, who is she speaking about at this point? But you can see that we're again changing point of view. We're again changing topic. In this poem, if you try to retrace all of the themes, the topics, the voices, the people that are being addressed, you've got shifts basically all over the place. Okay, so it's very stunted. This poem is very, uses a lot of different images and a lot of different ways of speaking to evoke all of these contradictions, basically. And you can feel these contradictions in the very way that the poet basically addresses these. Ça va? Any questions about this? So, we've got a final poem to work on for today. It's the longest one, but it's much easier to read than at Cedar Creek. This is a poem that's called Two Dream Times, and you can see that it's a poem dedicated to Kath Walker, Ujuru Nicole, that's her other name. Now, Kath Walker, that's her original name, and she renamed herself with an Aboriginal name. She's an Aboriginal poet. So you can see already that the two dream times are going to be the combination of the dream time of Wright and the dream time of Ujuru Nunakal. So talking about the two fates, the two stories of these two women that represent the Aboriginal community and the settler community. So I just got you two photographs. This is what Nunakal looked like later on. I think she died. And this is what she looked like when she was younger. Okay, so this is her, the most well-known collection of poetry that she published in the early 1960s. She was one of the first Aboriginal poets to publish a collection. So she was very important. She's very important. She's a very important figure in Aboriginal literature today. You can see this is what she looked like. So you can see here that this is again a different type of poem addressing a contemporary figure in Australian society. So, what is it we're doing with this? I can't remember. Alright. Okay, so have a read. Try to identify, of course, what the message of the poem is, and try to see if you can find some sort of structure, some sort of logic in the way the poem works. Okay? C'est parti. aborigènes plutôt sud-est. Parce que dans le sud-ouest, on va parler de Noongar en général. Enfin, il y a des termes comme ça un peu plus généraux. On peut parler des communautés particulières, ou alors des identités régionales, ou alors aborigènes. For those of you who are curious about Aboriginal culture, it's true we focus on the sort of settler side because it's impossible to do everything in a 12-week course. But the only national Aboriginal newspaper is called the Koori Mail. So this is, they've got lots of articles online and stuff like that if you're curious. Alright, so what sort of structure did you find for the poem? That is, what's the progression in the themes, maybe, or how did you make sense of this poem?
She's apologizing to the Aborigines.
Yep.
Then she includes herself in the robbers and the ones who deprive them of the land. Because she says, we the robbers. And then she describes the Eden dream time when she was a child and saw that land as a perfect one. And says that she was fooled. And in the end, she underlines the fact that they were born in two different worlds and were forbidden to play together as children, for instance.
Okay. Alright, perfect. I agree with what you said. We do have a, how can we say this? You do have a section that you identified here where Wright openly identifies with the settlers, with the people that brought destruction to Aboriginal people. So you can see that the poem is structured around this opposition between Aborigines and settlers. You can see this is quite characteristic of Wright's writing, that we're working with really binary oppositions. Okay, so the settlers are bad and the Aborigines are all super nice. I'm making fun a little, but it is true that we have some very binary constructions. And Wright here is either including herself in destructive settlers or trying to make the point that she's different because she's going towards a dialogue with Aboriginal people. But you can see that there's not much in between in what she writes. So you can see some of these moments here, some of these oppositions. You can see here that moment where she says, we the robbers, and then we are sisters in this and that way, but in other ways we cannot be brought closer together.
There is this opposition, but she also links herself to Katie. She says, at the end, she says several times, you and I are bought and sold, and because she feels betrayed by what settlers did, so she includes herself in the
I guess the poem's trying to solve these oppositions, saying like we come from two different groups that are historically opposed, where we've got so many common points, but there are differences between us that remain. So the whole poem is trying to negotiate in a way the distance or closeness between the two. She's trying to come to terms with that in her own way. I can't remember. Yes. So you can see all of those moments that shift. In particular, cette phrase, ces deux vers sont extrêmement connus, d'accord? I am one of the conquerors, you of the persecuted. You can see here the very binary thing, and then you can see here the comparisons that she's trying to make in the next sections of all of the common points that they basically share. Okay, so very much this. And the point that you made about the childhood, je sais plus où c'est par ici, non, c'est sur la deuxième page. Yes, you've got this section here, maybe you identify it. Let's go back to that far time. There's a moment when she invites going back to an idealized childhood. And you can see that this section ends here on line 71, but we are growing to a changed world. So in that section later, she emphasizes all of the differences. This is something that you find quite a lot in Wright. You probably saw this in the article as well, the very strong idealization of her childhood as being a moment when she was sort of one with the land before she understood that she basically had no legitimacy to that land. Okay, so you can see here it's extremely idealized.
And we say that she talks about also the dream that she lost too. She also tried to sympathy with her because she also lost her dream too, because before when she was a kid, she thought this land was belonged to her, and then she raised with this dream, this land is hers, and then when she grew up, she found out there is the mention, she said, I found that this land is not mine, somewhere, I don't know where was it, and then she says, when I found out this land is not mine, I was sad. So me too, I'm sad because I lost my dream like you lost your dream because it was your land, and then I don't have anything to offer for you, just my point. So I give my point to you to, like, sympathy with you. And then she also mentioned the knife, which is for me is a simplification. It's a symbolic of, I don't know, it's a fight or it's just a revenge. Revenge.
But what's the symbol with the knife at the end?
Well, I think she tell her the hammer of a knife I'm giving to you. It's just. It's your turn right now. Do you want to take a revenge? Or I don't know.
But she is, she gives this idea that there's a knife between them. And then she says, I turn the knife to you, the handle to your side. It's a symbolic empowerment. She's giving her the possibility to act. She's giving her the weapon. Now, of course, it's a metaphor image, but you can see that you've got that very symbolic moment at the end where she speaks about differences, similarities, and then at the end she basically submits, she accepts the legitimacy of Kath as a representative of Aborigines, and she gives her the power to wield the knife, basically. So maybe
by giving her the handle, she is telling her to take revenge not violently, but by protesting maybe.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I guess it's not an injunction to hurt people. It's more of a, there you are, we accept that it's your role to have the possibility to take action. So we're giving you the possibility to do this. As you said, it is this idea of empowering Aborigines through that very symbolic moment of giving the knife and giving her, submitting to it, basically.
Yeah, it's very strong, the image of the sisterhood.
Yeah.
So there are things that unite, and also things that separate, that divide. So that's
Yeah, definitely. As you said, the differences and the similarities are built through this image of sisters, which is there throughout the poem. One thing though, make sure that you don't confuse dream and dreamtime. You remember what the dreamtime refers to?
The Aborigines beliefs?
Yeah, it's pretty much a reference to the spirituality of Aboriginal people. So you can see that
basically Wright establishes that there are two, even in the title you've got two dream types of the opposition, and you've got this whole idea of the spiritual connection to the land, which is a different spiritual connection for Wright and for Cass. But you can see that she says that they both mourn it. Okay? Mourn it as you mourn, so the loss of her idealized land and the fact that she has no particular legitimacy on that land from her own point of view. But you can see, again, her representation trying to take an Aboriginal point of view in a way to represent this. Now, one thing that does need to be mentioned here is the fact that this poem is based on lots of generalizations. Okay, it's not based on their personal histories. You can see that Wright represents settlers, Uduru represents Aborigines. So you've got these very symbolic moments, and you can see that she takes Cass as a representative figure, as an emblematic figure for all Aborigines. Vous pouvez le voir assez facilement ici, où ils disent, they hadn't told me the land I loved was taken out of your hands. Alors, elle aurait très bien pu dire out of your community's hands, out of Aborigines' hands. Je ne sais pas si vous avez remarqué, il n'y a jamais le mot aborigène, très rare dans les poèmes de Wright, c'est souvent des choses plutôt des allusions, etc. Là-dedans, but you can see that here, she is in a way representing Australian history through their two figures. So all of the oppositions in Australian history through that. Ça va? As you can see, I don't get into too much detail here because, if you happen to have this in a commentary, I don't want you guys to be stuck by what we said in class. The idea is really to make sure in class together that for the poems we don't study in detail, that is all of them except for Nigger's Leap and Laura Ring, that you feel confident that you can work on these by yourself. So your homework for next week is double homework. The first thing that I'm asking you to do is to read the final two poems that we haven't worked on. Ça s'écrit comme ça. So there are two poems by Wright we haven't worked on, Old House and At Kalula. I'm asking you to read them and to write down any questions that you might have about the poems. D'accord? Si vous les lisez, vous allez voir, c'est les deux qui sont les plus accessibles. C'est les deux qu'on n'a pas lus dans la liste des poèmes. Vous prenez tous les poèmes de Wright et ceux qu'on n'a pas fait, vous les lisez. Have a read, try to see if you have any questions. Next week I'll ask you if you have any questions. If you don't, we'll move on to Maloof. Okay, so make sure that you feel happy, with your understanding of the poem by then. The second thing I'm asking you to do is to finish reading Remembering Babylon. Life of the Secret River, we'll make a list of the main characters, not really locations, there are 100 locations in Remembering Babylon, but the main characters, and we'll speak about the plot. So, finish reading it, and try to jot down the names of the main characters. Okay? See you next week.
Ah oui, comment on peut trouver les références dans le programme et on dit quel est le programme par exemple dans les séquences
Le programme de quoi?
Parce que moi j'ai trouvé un papier pour la semaine dernière, il a donné pour l'examen. Sur le papier, il a attaché une activité, par exemple, comme nous dans la classe, elle nous donne les livres pour expliquer quelle est unité, quelle est séquence, mais elle a demandé lire attentivement et expliquer par exemple quel objectif il y a, quelle séance et quelle référence, tu vois, dans quel niveau, quelle référence, et aussi...
Je pense que ça, si elle me demande,
Oh oui, d'accord.
si elle me demande,
Oui,
ça sera écrit dans le
portable, oui.
ça va me donner une page de manuel.
Une page de manuel. Le programme de cette séance est quoi? Moi, je ne sais pas trop, moi, je peux trouver quoi? Le niveau. Mais, au revoir. Et je te montrais le page que elle nous a donné.
Oui.
Ouais.
Tu sais qu'elle nous a donné un manuel.
Oui.
Quand on a fait l'exercice en
Oui.
classe, elle nous a donné le manuel
Oui.
et sur le manuel c'était marqué à 1.
Mais parce que dans l'examen, elle n'a pas marqué la.
Oui, mais je ne sais pas comment elle va faire. Mais après, il y a des niveaux comme ça. Par exemple, comme je disais, à la fin du cycle 4, il faut arriver à un niveau B1.
Cycle 4, BA.
Et à la fin du niveau de détermination, donc après,
Dans le collège.
au lycée,
Lycée, oui.
il faut arriver au niveau B2.
Oui.
Mais c'est...
À la fin. Au terminé, c'est B2. Ah oui, baccalauréat, c'est B2. Baccalauréat, c'est B2. Mais à la fin par exemple, le cours déterminé, c'est B1.
Terminal,
Le
c'est B2.
cycle terminal, B1.
Hein?
B1, oui. Le baccalauréat, oui, baccalauréat, c'est B2.
D'accord.
Oui.
Et bien avant, normalement, je pense que du coup, cycle 4, c'est B.
Je me souviens pas.
Il
Parce
est
que...
pas
Non,
phonétique.
je veux... Ok, bon, à tout à l'heure.